The Gallipoli campaign was a military campaign fought between the Allied forces and the Ottoman Empire from April 1915 to January 1916. The campaign was launched with the objective of opening up a new front against the Central Powers and establishing a direct sea route through the Dardanelles Strait to the Russian Empire, which was then an Allied power. The campaign was divided into two phases, a naval phase and a land phase. The naval phase began on February 19, 1915, when a fleet of British and French warships attempted to force their way through the Dardanelles Strait to bombard the Turkish capital, Constantinople. The Turkish force guarding the strait, however, proved more formidable than expected, and the naval attack was repelled with heavy losses. The failure of the naval assault forced the Allies to reconsider their strategy and to plan a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The land phase of the campaign began on April 25, 1915, when the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps ANZACs Anzacs landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, along with British and French troops. The Anzacs landed at a site now known as Anzac Cove, while the British and French forces landed at Helles and Saddlebaher. The campaign was led by General Sir Ian Hamilton, who believed that the capture of Gallipoli Peninsula would force Turkey out of the war and open up a new front against the Central Powers. Initially, the landings went relatively smoothly, with the Anzacs managing to establish a foothold on the peninsula. However, they soon encountered stiff resistance from the Ottoman defenders who had been alerted to the landings by the naval bombardments. The Ottomans, under the command of Mustafa Kemal, launched a fierce counterattack against the Anzacs, which forced them to dig in and hold their positions. The Anzacs were soon joined by reinforcements from the British and French, and the campaign developed into a brutal trench warfare stalemate, with both sides dug in and facing each other across a no man's land. The fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The terrain of the peninsula, with the steep cliffs, rugged terrain, and narrow beaches, made it difficult for the troops to maneuver and for the commanders to coordinate their movements. The Anzacs, in particular, suffered heavily, with more than 8,000 Australian and New Zealand troops killed during the campaign. The campaign was characterized by a series of offensives and counteroffensives by both sides as they attempted to break the deadlock and gain a decisive advantage. One of the most significant battles of the campaign was the Battle of Lone Pine, fought between August 6 and 10, 1915. The battle was fought by Australian troops who launched a surprise attack on Turkish trenches in an attempt to break through their lines. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Australians were eventually able to capture the Turkish trenches. But the victory was short-lived as the Turks quickly launched a counterattack and forced the Australians back. Another significant battle was the Battle of Chunuk Bair, fought between August 6th and 10th, 1915. The battle was fought by New Zealand troops who were tasked with capturing the high ground around Chunuk Bair, a key strategic position overlooking the peninsula. Despite early success, the New Zealanders were unable to hold their position, and the Turks launched a counterattack that forced them back. As the campaign dragged on, the Allies became increasingly disillusioned with their lack of progress and mounting casualties. General Hamilton was eventually replaced by General Sir Charles Monro, who recommended that the campaign be abandoned. The final Allied offensive, launched in December 1915, was a last-ditch attempt to break through the Turkish lines and capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. The offensive, known as the Battle of Sari Bair, was a failure, and the Allies were forced to withdraw from the peninsula in January 1916. The Gallipoli campaign was a strategic failure for the Allies as it failed to achieve its objectives of opening up a new front against the Central Powers and securing a direct sea route to Russia. The legacy of the Gallipoli campaign can still be felt today, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, where Anzac Day is celebrated annually on April 25th to commemorate the landing of Anzac troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The campaign also had a profound impact on the Ottoman Empire, contributing to the rise of Turkish nationalism and the eventual overthrow of the Ottoman government. In conclusion, the Gallipoli campaign was a major military campaign fought during World War I, which had significant political and social consequences for both the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. The campaign was characterized by brutal trench warfare, heavy casualties, and a lack of progress, and ultimately ended in failure for the Allies. Despite its failure, the campaign remains an important part of the history and identity of Australia and New Zealand, and it serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by soldiers during World War I. The naval arms race between Germany and Britain in the years leading up to World War I had led to the construction of even more powerful and heavily armed battleships. The two fleets were evenly matched in terms of numbers and firepower, but there were significant differences in tactics and technology. The British Grand Fleet was commanded by Admiral John Jellicoe, who was commanding the Northern Fleet near Cape of Flow, and Vice Admiral Beatty, who was commanding the Southern Fleet near Rosyth, while the German High Seas Fleet was commanded by Admiral Reinhard Scheer. The battle was the culmination of a long running naval arms race between the two nations and was expected to be a decisive engagement. The British fleet consisted of 28 battleships and 9 battle cruisers, while the German fleet had 16 battleships and 5 battle cruisers. Both sides also had a significant number of smaller ships, including destroyers and torpedo boats. The German High Seas Fleet was designed to fight close to shore, with a focus on short range, rapid fire guns that could engage enemy ships at close range. In contrast, the British Grand Fleet was designed for long range engagements with larger guns that could fire at greater distances. The British fleet also had a significant advantage in terms of intelligence thanks to its code breaking efforts that allowed it to intercept and decode German naval communications. The battle began on the morning of May 31, 1916, when the German fleet, which had been trying to lure the British fleet into an ambush, was spotted by British cruisers. The British fleet was split into two main groups, with Admiral Jellicoe's Grand Fleet in the north and Vice Admiral Beatty's battle cruisers in the south. The two groups began to converge on the German fleet, which was sailing in a line ahead formation. The battle cruisers' engagement between Beatty's ships and the German battle cruisers was one of the most intense and dramatic parts of the battle. The British battle cruisers were faster and more maneuverable than the German ships, but they were also more vulnerable due to their weak armor. The German battle cruisers were armed with 11-inch guns, while the British battle cruisers had 13.5-inch guns, giving them an advantage in firepower. The engagement began when Beatty's ships spotted the German battle cruisers and opened fire. The Germans responded with accurate salvos, hitting the HMS Lion and causing serious damage. The British ships responded with their own accurate fire, causing significant damage to the SMS Seydlitz and the SMS Derfflinger. However, the battle took a turn for the worse for the British when the HMS Queen Mary was hit by a shell and exploded, sinking in just a few minutes with the loss of all but two of its crew. The explosion was caused by a catastrophic failure of the ship's ammunition stores, which had been hit by a shell. As the main fleets converged, the battle turned into a massive gunnery duel, with both sides firing salvos at each other from long range. The Germans had an advantage in that they had more advanced gunnery technology, which allowed them to fire more accurately at longer ranges. However, the British had a numerical advantage with more ships and heavier shells that caused more damage to the German ships. The tactical stalemate of the battle has been the subject of much debate and analysis over the years. Some historians have criticized Jellicoe for being too cautious and not taking more risks to engage the German fleet. Others have pointed to technical issues such as the quality of the British shells and the fact that the German ships were faster and more maneuverable. Despite the tactical inconclusiveness of the battle, it had significant strategic implications. The British maintained control of the North Sea and were able to continue their blockade of Germany, which played a role in the eventual collapse of the German war effort. The battle also marked a turning point in naval warfare as the advent of more advanced technologies such as radar and aircraft carriers would make a large-scale naval battles like Jutland much less common in future conflicts. The battle was the largest naval battle of the war and one of the largest in history, involving more than 250 warships and over 100,000 sailors. The battle was strategically important for both sides and had significant implications for the course of the war. The German High Seas Fleet had hoped to engage and defeat the British fleet in a decisive battle that would allow them to break the British naval blockade and gain control of the North Sea. However, the British Grand Fleet, under the command of Admiral Jellicoe, was able to maintain its numerical superiority and prevent the German fleet from achieving its objectives. The battle also highlighted the limitations of the battleships as a weapon of war. The development of new technologies such as submarines, torpedoes, and aircrafts would eventually make the battleships less relevant in naval warfare. The Battle of Jutland was one of the last major battles in which battleships played a decisive role. On the morning of September 6, 1914, the German army was just 30 miles away from the French capital, Paris. They had swept through Belgium and Luxembourg, taking control of much of northern France in the process. The French were desperately trying to regroup and find a way to stop the German advance. What followed was one of the most significant battles of the First World War, the Battle of the Marne. The Battle of the Marne lasted for 5 days and was fought along the Marne River, southeast of Paris. The German army was commanded by General Helmut von Moltke, who was following the Schlieffen Plan. This was a strategy that called for the swift defeat of France before turning the German army's attention towards Russia. The plan involved a massive invasion of France through Belgium and Luxembourg, with the goal of encircling and trapping the French army. However, the plan relied on quick movements and surprise, but the German army had become bogged down in heavy fighting, which slowed their progress. The French army, led by General Joseph Joffre, had been retreating towards Paris, but with the German army closing in, they needed to make a stand. They began to fortify positions along the Marne River, hoping to hold back the German advance. The Germans were the first ones to dig trenches in order to avoid enemy fire. The artillery couldn't locate the troops hidden in the trenches, and direct firing weapons couldn't fire in the trenches, and the use of hand grenades couldn't be done from a far distance. The trenches saved the Germans from heavy losses, while the French didn't consider it honorable to hide in trenches during war and had to face mounting losses. But later on, they understood that honor doesn't have any place in a war. The battle began on September 6th, with the German army launching a massive assault on the French positions. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Germans had two armies in the region. The western one, commanded by Field Marshal Karl von Bülow, had made a north-south line facing Paris to defend against the French advances. He brought his forces closer to each other for a counterattack on French forces, but this made a gap of more than 30 kilometers between von Bülow and the Eastern Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck. The British Expeditionary Force took advantage of the gap and advanced, breaking the contact between the two German armies. However, the French army was able to hold its ground, and on September 8th, Joffre launched a massive counterattack. He ordered over 2 million troops to attack the German lines using a combination of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. While Germans were reinforcing, the French general did something out of the ordinary. He ordered all of the taxis in Paris to be used to transport French troops to the front lines, which were more than 50 kilometers away from Paris, which was not expected by anyone, not even the Germans. This swift movement of the French troops to the front lines enabled them to strike first on the Germans and delivered the reinforcements where they were needed the most. The German army was caught off guard by the counterattack and their lines began to crumble. The movement of British troops into the gap between the German armies and the utilization of taxis to move the troops impacted the result of the battle in favor of the Allies, and Germans were forced to retreat, and the Battle of the Marne became a decisive victory for the Allied forces. The Battle of the Marne had a significant impact on the course of the war. It marked the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and forced the German army into a prolonged and grueling trench warfare battle. It also showed the importance of mobility and flexibility in modern warfare. Today, the Marne River is a peaceful and scenic location, but it serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Marne. It was a critical moment in the history of the First World War, and its legacy is still felt today. The Battle of Somme was a major battle of World War I fought between the Allied forces of British Empire and the French Republic against the German army. The battle began on July 1, 1916 and lasted until November 18, 1916. It is considered one of the bloodiest battles in human history with over 1 million casualties on all sides. The battle was fought along a 25-mile front near the Somme River in northern France. The objective of the Allied forces was to break through the German defenses and advance towards the city of Bapaume, which was a key strategic objective. The battle began with a massive artillery bombardment that lasted for 7 days, during which over 1.5 million shells were fired at the German positions. On July 1, 1916, the British launched their attack with a massive infantry assault. The soldiers were ordered to walk slowly towards the German trenches in what was known as a walking barrage, which was intended to keep the Germans pinned down and prevent them from returning fire. However, the Germans had dug deep trenches and fortified positions that were well defended by machine guns and artillery. As the British troops advanced, they were met with heavy resistance and suffered enormous casualties. In the first day alone, over 60,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing in action. The battle continued for several months, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The French forces launched their own attack on the German lines on July 14, but they too suffered heavy casualties. Despite the enormous losses, the Allied forces continued to push forward, gradually gaining ground and making small gains. However, the German defenses held strong and the Allies were unable to achieve a breakthrough. The Battle of Somme ended in November 1916 after 4.5 months of intense fighting. The battle was the largest and most costly battle of World War I, with over 1 million casualties on all sides. The end of the battle was due to a combination of factors, including exhaustion and casualties on both sides, changes in tactics, and the arrival of winter weather. By the end of October 1916, both sides were exhausted and had suffered heavy losses. The Germans had been able to hold off the Allied advance, and the Allies had been unable to break through the German lines. The fighting had also taken a toll on the soldiers' morale and had caused a significant strain on resources. In addition to these factors, the arrival of winter weather in November made the conditions for fighting even more difficult. The ground became muddy and waterlogged, making it almost impossible to move artillery and supplies. The cold weather and lack of shelter also made it challenging for soldiers to endure the harsh conditions in the trenches. The end of the battle was also due to changes in tactics and technology. The Allies began to use new tactics such as creeping barrages and the use of tanks, which helped them to make incremental gains. They also developed new weapons such as gas that were effective against the German defenses. These changes eventually helped the Allies to break through the German lines and win the war. The Battle of Somme was a major turning point in World War I. It demonstrated the enormous cost of modern warfare and the limitations of infantry tactics against modern defensive technologies. The battle also marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, in which the Allies began to adopt new tactics and technologies such as tanks and gas warfare that would eventually help them to achieve victory. In conclusion, the Battle of Somme was a brutal and bloody conflict that claimed the lives of over 1 million soldiers on both sides. It was a key moment in World War I and had a profound impact on the course of the war. The legacy of the battle is still felt today, as it serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating cost of war and the importance of seeking peaceful solutions to conflict. The battle took place from 26th August to 30th August 1914 near the town of Tannenberg in East Prussia, which is now part of modern-day Poland. At the time, the Russian Empire was determined to fight against Germany and its allies because Germany had attacked France through Belgium and Luxembourg, following the Schlieffen Plan. Russia deployed two armies to East Prussia with the aim of defeating the German army stationed there. The Russian troops were commanded by two generals, Alexander Samsonov and Paul von Rennenkampf. They had more than 200,000 troops and were divided into two groups. Samsonov led the second army towards Tannenberg, while Rennenkampf led the first army towards the city of Allenstein. The only issue was that these two commanders of the two Russian armies didn't get along very well. Both disliked each other and were not on the same page. They pursued different strategies and didn't communicate well with each other. The German army, led by experienced generals like Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, was called back into service at the age of 67 years long after retirement, had a smaller force of around 150,000 troops, but was well equipped and had the advantage of being on their home soil. Russian commanders communicated and passed the orders using wireless radio sets, which the Germans were able to intercept and decode, and knew the exact location of the Russian troops, their movements, and their plans. The German army was well prepared for the battle, and they used this advantage to launch a surprise attack on the Russian troops. The Russians had planned that the Second Army would attack from the southern side of Tannenberg in order to sandwich the German forces deployed near the border. This order was also decoded by the Germans effectively, and they devised a plan to counter this threat. It was planned that the Germans would take the initiative and attack the Second Russian Army first. The Germans used the railways to transport the troops quickly to the positions, which was not known by the Russians. On August 26th, the German army launched a surprise attack on Samsonov's Second Army. The Russian troops were taken by surprise, and chaos and confusion ensued. The German army was able to use their superior communication and coordination to outflank and surround the Russian troops. The Russian troops were unprepared for the attack and suffered heavy losses. Samsonov's Second Army was completely surrounded, and his troops were cut off from communication and supplies. The German army continued to attack the Russian troops from all sides, and the Russian troops were unable to break through the German lines. Samsonov realized that his army was doomed and attempted to escape with his staff. However, they were pursued by German troops, and Samsonov eventually shot himself and committed suicide. Meanwhile, Rennenkampf's First Army was engaging the German army near Allenstein. However, the Russian troops were not able to coordinate with each other, and Rennenkampf was not able to provide support to Samsonov's Second Army. On 30th August, the German army achieved a decisive victory over the Russian troops. The Russians suffered heavy losses, with around 78,000 troops killed, wounded, or missing, and around 92,000 taken as prisoners of war. The German army suffered only around 12,000 casualties. The Battle of Tannenberg was a significant turning point in World War I. It demonstrated the superiority of the German army and the weakness of the Russian army. The battle had a significant impact on the war, and the German victory paved the way for further German victories on the Eastern Front. In conclusion, the Battle of Tannenberg was a brutal and devastating battle that resulted in a significant victory for the German army. The Russian defeat was due to several factors, including the lack of modern weapons, communication systems, and coordination between the Russian commanders. The battle had far-reaching consequences for World War I, and it remains a significant event in the history of the war. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, when the German army launched a massive attack on the fortified town of Verdun, located in northeastern France. The German objective was to break through the French lines and take control of the town, which was strategically located near the border with Germany. But the French were determined to hold on to their positions, and what followed was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The German plan was to launch a massive offensive against the French lines using a combination of artillery, infantry, and new technologies such as flamethrowers and poison gas. The Germans believed that they could break through the French lines and capture Verdun in a matter of days. But the French had other ideas. General Philippe Pétain was in charge of the French forces, and he was determined to hold on to Verdun at all costs. On the other hand, the German army was being commanded by General Erich von Falkenhayn, who was determined to capture Verdun in order to reach Paris, the capital of France. The initial German assault was fierce and relentless. The French lines were pounded by heavy artillery, and the German infantry advanced with flamethrowers and poison gas. The French troops were caught off guard and suffered heavy casualties. But they held on, and in the days and weeks that followed, the battle became a war of attrition. The French strategy was to hold on to their positions even if it meant sacrificing their soldiers in the process. The German strategy was to inflict as many casualties as possible on the French, even if it meant sacrificing their own soldiers. The result was a stalemate that lasted for months. One of the key events of the battle was the capture of Fort Douaumont by the Germans on February 25, 1916. Fort Douaumont was a heavily fortified position that had been considered impregnable by the French. However, due to a miscommunication among the French troops, the fort was left virtually unguarded, and the Germans were able to seize it with minimal resistance. The loss of Fort Douaumont was a major blow to the morale of the French army, as it was a key position that provided artillery support and observation over the surrounding area. The German army quickly reinforced the fort and used it as a base for their operations. Over the following months, the French army launched several unsuccessful attempts to recapture Fort Douaumont, suffering heavy casualties in the process. However, on October 24, 1916, the French finally succeeded in retaking the fort, thanks in part to the use of improved artillery and tactics. The recapture of Fort Douaumont was a major turning point in the battle, as it restored the confidence of the French troops and allowed them to launch a counter-offensive against the Germans. The French army was able to push the Germans back and regain much of the ground that had been lost earlier in the battle. The Battle of Verdun was significant for several reasons. First, it was a turning point in the war. Before Verdun, the Germans had been winning the war, but after Verdun, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies. The battle was also significant because it demonstrated the horrors of modern warfare. The use of new technologies such as flamethrowers and poison gas had a devastating effect on the soldiers and the civilians caught in the crossfire. Despite the heavy losses on both sides, the French were ultimately able to hold on to Verdun. They were able to bring in fresh troops and supplies, while the Germans suffered from lack of resources and manpower. The French also had the advantage of being on the defensive, which allowed them to conserve their resources and wear down the German army. The end of the war came in November 1918 when the Allies launched a massive offensive against the German army. The German army was exhausted and demoralized, and they were unable to withstand the assault. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended hostilities between the Allies and Germany. The Battle of Verdun was a major turning point in World War I. It demonstrated the horrors of modern warfare and the toll it takes on soldiers and civilians alike. It was also significant because it marked the beginning of the end of the German offensive. The French were able to hold on to Verdun, and this gave the Allies a much needed boost in morale. The battle will always be remembered as one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles in human history, but it will also be remembered as a testament to the resilience and determination of soldiers who fought there. The Battle of Amiens was fought between August 8th and August 11th, 1918, near the city of Amiens in northern France. It was a significant battle of World War I fought between the Allied and the German forces. The Allied forces included British, Canadian, Australian, French, and the American troops and were commanded by General Sir Henry Rawlinson, while the German forces were led by General Ludendorff. The Battle of Amiens was part of the larger Hundred-Day Offensive, a series of Allied offensives launched between August and November 1918, which aimed to break the stalemate on the Western Front and push the German forces back towards their own borders. The Allied forces, under the command of General Sir Henry Rawlinson, devised a strategy that combined infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircrafts in a coordinated and integrated assault on the German lines. The battle was preceded by a 2-week period of preparation, which involved moving troops and equipment to the front, as well as launching diversionary attacks to confuse the German forces. August 8, 1918, the attack is launched at 4:20 am with a massive artillery barrage that targeted the German trenches and destroyed much of their barbed wire defenses. The infantry attack followed closely behind, supported by tanks and aircraft that provided cover and reconnaissance. By 8 am, the Allied forces had broken through the German lines and advanced up to 8 kilometers on the first day of the battle. The success of the attack can be attributed to the effective use of new tactics and technologies such as the use of creeping barrages and the integration of tanks and aircrafts into the assault. On August 9, 1918, the Allied forces continued their advance, pushing deeper into the German lines and capturing several key positions. However, the German forces began to recover from their initial shock and mounted a counterattack which was repulsed by the Allied forces. On August 10, 1918, the Allied forces made further gains, capturing several more key positions and inflicting heavy losses on the German forces. The success of the attack was due in part to the effective coordination between different branches of the military, particularly the integration of tanks and aircrafts into the assault. August 11, 1918 was the final day of the battle that saw the Allied forces consolidate their gains and prepare for further advances. By the end of the battle, the Allied forces had advanced up to 12 kilometers and captured over 5,000 German prisoners. The Allies suffered more than 19,000 casualties, including the wounded, while the Germans suffered more than 26,000 casualties, including the captured troops. The battle was a complete surprise to the Germans, who were caught off guard and unable to respond effectively. The defeat was a demoralizing blow to the German forces, who had previously believed that they could hold their lines against any Allied assault. The success of the attack boosted morale and confidence among the Allied troops, who had suffered heavy losses and made little progress on the Western Front in the previous years. The success of the Battle of Amiens can be attributed to a number of factors. One was the effective use of new tactics and technologies, such as the use of creeping barrages, which involved a slow-moving artillery barrage that advanced ahead of the infantry, providing cover and suppressing enemy fire. Another was the effective coordination between different branches of the military, particularly the integration of tanks and aircraft into the assault. The Battle of Amiens was a decisive victory for the Allies and marked the beginning of the end of the World War I. The success of the battle paved the way for further Allied offensives, which pushed the German forces back towards their own borders and forced them to accept an armistice on November 11, 1918. The legacy of the Battle of Amiens can still be felt today, particularly in France and the United Kingdom, where the battle is remembered as a significant turning point in the war. The battle also had a significant impact on military tactics and strategy as it demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated and integrated assaults using new technologies. In conclusion, the Battle of Amiens was a significant battle fought during World War I, which marked a turning point in the war and paved the way for Allied victory. The battle was notable for its effective use of new tactics and technologies and for its psychological impact on both the Allied and the German forces. The legacy of the Battle of Amiens can still be felt today and serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the soldiers during World War I.